Did y'all answer it right? Move on. Linda's telling me to hurry up. She already has the answer. So, all right, what do we think? What is Jesus doing right now? He's head of the church, okay? So he is presently ruling and reigning over the church. The senior pastor, Jesus calls him in 1 Peter chapter 5. Chief shepherd. Anything else? Yep. Preparing a place. Yeah, he goes away. I prepare a place for you. Okay. Well, here's the point. Let me take a step back. Here's the reason we're beginning in this conversation is that our sense of time and what's happening before us and ahead of us gives a lot of motivation for like why we happen to live or make particular decisions. Like if you have certain right or wrong beliefs about the past or the future, it dramatically changes the way that you might live in the present. I was even thinking about this. Did y'all see a couple weeks ago when the NASA scientists, I think this was February 15th, said out of nowhere, NASA Twitter just drops this, or I guess NASA X at this point, that there was like an asteroid the size of a football field that had like an almost 5% chance to hit us in the year 2032. Did anybody see that? Yeah, and everybody was panicked, right? Everybody was like, right now, if you think that's going to happen in the future, it is going to dramatically change the way that you might live in the present, right? Like for example, if you had like a really kind of firm confidence of like, the world's going to blow up in the year 2032, you might take your money out of the stock market. You might take that trip to Italy that you would always plan to have. Whatever it is, what we believe about certain moments of time spill into the present. It is funny, by the way, a week later, February 22nd, they were like, whoops, actually, it's a 0.0004% chance. And like, what was that, a rounding error? Did that scientist have like a bad Valentine's Day and just get into like a dark place as he was doing interpretations and calculations? I don't know what it is, but does that make sense? And we just kind of go about our lives. The way that we understand the timeline of history has profound implications over the way that we live our life. Now, all of that's to frame this next portion of the Apostles' Creed, where it's very interesting. You are going to notice a change of the verb tenses, where up to this point, everything that the Creed has said up to this point has been past tense. If you look on the back page, you can see, Jesus was conceived, he was born, he suffered, he was crucified, he descended, and then here it is, he ascended, and then what we're going to see is, and is seated. Now, my degree was not in English, it was in history. I have written a few papers in my life, and I do remember a little bit of verb tenses in terms of we have now gone from the past tense to the present tense and having this conversation about what it is that Jesus is currently doing. If you look at the opening verse, Romans 8, verses 34 through 35, Paul says this in terms of Jesus is doing active work right now. Who is to condemn? Jesus Christ, the one who died, more than that, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us. Exactly to your point, you have a scriptural basis for the experience you had today, which is so unbelievably beautiful. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? So we're in the portion of the Creed where we're going to look at, Thomas very graciously did not leave me with on the third day he rose again and then went out of town. That would have not been a very loving thing for him to do. And so he sacrificially took that one, and he has left me with this. Jesus ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. On the third day he rose again, he ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. So we're going to see three crucial statements, one about the resurrection of Jesus, one about the ascension of Jesus, and then one about what is it that Jesus is currently doing now? What does it mean that he is seated at the right hand of the Father? All right, let me pray, and then we will try to dive into this, and then we'll do this kind of 3 mini talks, some time for a question, and then at the end of those 3 segments, you can ask anything about anything, except for last week's teaching. I don't want to answer any questions about that. That was a challenging one. God, thank you that you're with us, and thank you not only are you interceding, but that even we have a fresh testimony in the room to that reality tonight. We want fresh work, fresh loaves of bread, fresh testimonies, fresh work, fresh wind, fresh fire in this place and in this community. We don't want to just have kind of thoughts about you. We want to know you. We want to experience you. Jesus, you are alive and you're moving and you're active. And your heart, as we'll see at the end of this, your heart to us right now in this moment is the same as your heart towards your disciples in the first century. And the great news is you are not physically limited to the other side of the globe, and you're not generationally limited to 2,000 years ago. You are eternal, and you are living and active, and you are with us in this space. Would you lead and guide our time and our conversation? And we ask these things in your powerful name. Amen. All right. Resurrection, ascension, and Jesus is seated. We'll try to wrap our mind around what this means. Maybe I feel a little bit of fear of trepidation in saying this. I probably am going to spend the least amount of time on the resurrection, not because it's insignificant. Paul actually calls it of first importance, so I'm not trying to be dismissive of that. But I think that's the one thing that we talk a lot about, especially around this time of Easter. And so what we don't spend a lot of time talking about is the ascension of Jesus. Actually, J.T. English, who has written a few books and was a fellow church planter out in Colorado, he actually calls the ascension the forgotten aspect of the gospel. Because a lot of times we don't even talk about the ascension. And then Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father. I mean, at that point, we're just like, look, we already quit at ascension. So like, how are we going to talk about Jesus being seated and what does that mean? And even, I'll just root this in my experience today. I'm a firm believer. I don't think you'll ever get the church planter out of me. And so I just try to be like outside walking around doing meetings out and about as much as possible. And I had kind of gotten caged up to such a degree that I was like, I'm just going to walk Broadway this afternoon. It's like beautiful, and I want the sun hitting my skin as much as possible, as beautiful as it is. And it really moved me to my core, thinking about what Jesus is doing when he's seated at the right hand of the Father, the implications that he is making intercession, and his heart towards us as we go about doing life. A lot of times discouraged or overwhelmed or fearful. Having tragedy either hit us directly or somebody in our sphere of influence hit, and we wonder, does anybody see us or love us or care for us? And this aspect of the creed that a lot of times we don't talk about very much is a real testimony to this reality. All right, let's start with the resurrection. The creed says, on the third day, Jesus rose again. And with each of these, I'm going to do kind of a denial. Thomas has been doing this, and he actually does this in his forthcoming book. So I like doing this. Like, what we don't mean is this, and what we do mean is this. Okay, so what we don't mean with the resurrection is the resurrection was not conspiratorial. When I say conspiratorial, what I mean is, it's interesting. I went to the University of South Carolina. Yep, that's the reaction I usually get. Just cold silence and like some of you being like, you poor thing. Yeah, I know. Like the Gamecocks are a sad group of people, but we are loyal to the end, and that's what a Gamecock is. It's a chicken that fights to the death. And so I am faithful, if I'm anything, and stubborn. And it's interesting. Kind of a little bit about my story. I grew up not really going to church. My parents were great, and they loved us very much, but it's a whole story for a whole other time. We just didn't grow up in that world very much. So I became a Christian at the age of 18. I had originally gone to college to play baseball. I dropped out after a couple of months. I went to community college for a year, and I restarted my life at the University of South Carolina. And I'm going in. I didn't know any Christians. I was saved through the reading of the Bible. I was just desperate at age 18. I read the Bible. God saved me through reading the Bible. And I didn't really know any Christians just because of the circles that we ran in growing up. And I go to the University of South Carolina, and I'm like, you know what I'm going to do? Like, I'm going to major in history, but I'm going to minor in religious studies because I want to learn as much about my faith as possible. Now, here's the thing they don't tell you on a big secular college campus is the people who hate Orthodox Christianity the most are the people who teach religious studies on those campuses. And it was like professor after professor who prided themselves on trying to take, some sweet, well-intentioned kid that grew up in a Baptist church, and he's been like, well, actually, in the original language, the text says this, and they're like, I didn't even know the Bible was written in Greek, and like, they by all of a sudden, they've denied the faith that they were brought up in. It was very, so it's interesting. I took a New Testament studies class, and it was interesting. My professor of New Testament studies was a huge advocate for something. It's not as well known now, but it was a couple decades ago, called the Jesus Seminar. Anybody ever heard of the Jesus Seminar? John Dominic Crossan, J.D. Crossan, and a bunch of professors who I would say were educated beyond their own wisdom, who would say that their explanation of the resurrection is that it was merely a conspiracy, a bunch of power-hungry guys. And you saw a little bit of this in books like the Da Vinci Code not that long ago. A bunch of power-hungry guys got together, got in a room, and like, you know what, we can like really get some power. There was some misunderstanding of this guy named Jesus, and actually like the Jesus Seminar, for example, would say that Jesus' body was eaten by dogs. And then these guys got together, and they were like, oh, actually, he resurrected from the dead. We saw it, nobody else can see it, and they got power from that particular way. So we would deny that. We would deny that, that this was a conspiracy. And we'll also deny the fact that the resurrection was metaphorical. So in various progressive expressions of Christianity who deny miracles, okay? So these are expressions of Christianity that would be saying, like we're okay with the morality of Christianity, but we are scientific, educated, enlightened people. We know that miracles don't happen. And so consequently, the way that they would explain the resurrection is it is not a physical bodily resurrection, but it is a metaphor of a resurrection of hope. These guys were discouraged, and then they got kind of a new spirit of hope, and God sort of vaguely from a distance poured warm affection and love a bit into their hearts. I don't know how they explain that without being supernatural with it at the same time. And we know, if there's anything we know, like we're scientific, educated, anybody who went to college knows dead people don't get up from the grave. So we would deny that it's conspiratorial, we would deny that it's metaphorical, and we would say that the resurrection was physical, bodily, like Jesus actually physically, bodily died, and he actually physically, bodily resurrected. I'm going to give you some verses for this as we look at this. So for example, it's interesting, even in Luke, in the resurrection account, there's a very explicit affirmation of you saying, I'm not a spirit. He says in verse 39, see my hands and my feet, that it is I myself, touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. And when he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. I also love that, like Jesus right after that scene just eats fish. Like, it's just like, in case you denied he was a real person doing real human things, like he's eating fish on the shore, doing not what a spirit does, but what a physical body would do. We would say too, that the resurrection is historically and philosophically reliable. Even for me, having come to Christianity, quote unquote, late to life, and in particular, there was a lot of people who were influential in my life who were discouraging me from coming to the faith and saying that, intelligent people don't believe this stuff is true. For me, coming to faith at 18, the thing that really sealed this thing as real was the resurrection. Like, I think the most historically, I think if you follow the evidence where it leads, the best explanation for why all the claims happened in the Bible is that they actually happened. And that the resurrection is the singular best apologetic and explanation that like all of the scriptures are actually true. Third would be it's a declaration of victory, So if you think about this, even though we have progressed significantly as a species, right? Like our quality of life now is much better than it was 100 years ago. Like my wife and I, anybody watch like any of the Yellowstone variants, like 1880 whatever and 1923. You know what I'm talking about? Anybody watch Yellowstone or any of this stuff? And it portrays a picture of like what life looked like in the West 100 years ago. And it's just like everybody dying all the time of things that we've like have cures for and solutions for. I'm not endorsing the series. I'm just saying like, you're like, man, it would have been really hard to live even 100 years ago. Like things have gotten much better technologically, medicinally, educationally, and yet the greatest problems that plague us, we have only been able to put off a little bit more. So the problem of death, for example, we might have extended the life expectancy of a person, but like nobody's fixed the problem of death. The problem of Satan, sin, death, hell, the things that we as a species, regardless of the fact that like, it is wild that I could like FaceTime with my mom right now if I wanted to. Like, that's magical. If you showed that to somebody 100 years ago, they'd be like, you're a wizard, right? They would be like, that is crazy that you're able to do that. I still have no answer for Satan, sin, death, hell, other than the resurrection that is the declaration that the things that we have no solutions for, Christ has secured on our behalf, and by grace through faith, not only is his death our death, but his victory is our victory. when Jesus doesn't just actually die, but gets back up from the grave 3 days later, and all of this tragic place is thrown and placed upon Jesus, the worst that the world has to offer, and he walks away victorious, it is the declaration that the worst has been thrown at me, I've taken it upon myself, and I have conquered it. It is the fulfillment of the promise of Genesis 3:15, you will crush the head of the serpent, and it is finished through the work of Christ.
Amen.
Thank you. Fourth, there's a tangible sign of hope with the resurrection as well, a tangible sign of hope. For example, Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, which 1 Thessalonians is talking largely about the implications of the resurrection and how it injects hope into the early church, which if you study any of these kind of historical contexts in which Paul was writing into, I mean, they're all going through unimaginable tragedy. I mean, it's crisis left and right. And it's just so interesting. Paul says that because of the resurrection of Christ, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who are asleep, which is the way that you would reference people who were dead in the church, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. So he's saying to the church that because of the resurrection, we do grieve. I mean, even today, I took a crisis phone call from a friend down in Texas, and he just hit the 1-year anniversary of his dad dying, and it just hit him at a new level today. Like, we grieve, but we don't grieve as those who have no hope. Why? Why? Because there's a real historical moment where death was thrown onto our Savior and he got back up again. Without exception, every single person has been conquered by death. But Jesus rose victorious, not just conquering, but extending a promise as well, is that when you believe in me, when you receive me, when you say I'm yours and I say you're mine, the full rights, riches, benefits of mine are bestowed and gifted upon you. It's unbelievable. So here's the first question of the night, okay? How does the resurrection provide tangible hope for a problem you are currently experiencing in your life? Okay? How does the resurrection provide tangible hope for a problem you are currently experiencing in your life? Do a couple minutes of table talk, and then I'll move us on to the ascension. Anything you feel like is worth sharing with the? We've already been blessed with a little bit of a public testimony. Anything you feel like you want to share? And don't you love when you get volunteered by somebody else to? You want to share?
That shows me that I'm supposed to talk.
Yeah, great.
So tomorrow it's the 2-year anniversary of the school shooting at the government school, and I work there. And our kids went through there. And so what this question made me think of is that the 6 that died that day, I have no doubt where they are, where they went immediately. And to me, those halls will be sacred forever because of that, because I know what happened, and it was beautiful. And so that's what that means. Without the resurrection,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be possible.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And absolutely true too, right? Because without the resurrection, we don't, like, what do we try to say things to comfort people. And I mean, it's just interesting the way as culture has become increasingly secularized. And, you know, you'll notice that, for example, like people have removed from their vernacular, like thoughts and prayers, and they're usually like, you know, sending good vibes your way. It's like, well, if you're a parent, you know, it's like, I know one of the parents that lost their daughter in that shooting. You know, what is good vibes going to do for him? What is good thoughts going to do for him? Like, if you're going to have any comfort or hope for the future in the midst of experiencing something so horrific, like, I don't, like the resurrection, we need it. We need it. Absolutely true. Yesterday, was it yesterday? Monday, a beloved couple in the life of our church in Denver. Are you getting hit with the sun? Do we need to? Yeah, okay. What can we do here? Okay, thank you. Yeah. Wow. This is the most excited y'all have been. We are talking about the resurrection. You know that, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right, exactly. Is it further? Keep going all the way down. Is that better? Okay. Y-
Contemporary Christian song on the radio these days, and I know we're all, most of us, too sophisticated to listen to that contemporary Christian stuff, but one of the phrases in one of the songs that's sort of a background doo-wop sound. You hear these female voices singing over and over, "I'm dancing on the grave that I once lived near.
You are dancing on the grave that what?
I'm dancing on the grave that I once lived in.
Hmm.
Dancing on the grave that I once lived in."
I wouldn't dance on the grave I once lived in. Hmm. Yeah. 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 And we'll talk about this a little bit with the ascension, but to bridge it, it's interesting. On Monday, a beloved couple in the church that we planted out in Colorado, the wife was a professor at CU Boulder, the husband was a professor of economics. Really just a unique couple that, was like the couple in their 70s with a bunch of 20-year-olds who were trying to like figure their lives out. And just to show you the type of couple they are, he bought a Cybertruck 2 days ago for turning 70, and he's driving it cross country. So he hit Nashville a couple days ago and showed him the church and everything like that. And it's really interesting. Their names are Kirk and Ruth. And Ruth, when she gave birth to her daughter Joy, they found out pretty much as soon as she was born that she had very serious health issues and disabilities as well. Blind, autistic, so many ranges of issues. Her husband at the time abandoned her because he was basically like, this isn't what I signed up for. And later in life, Kirk took them in, and really, really beautiful couple. But it's interesting because Joy, their daughter, who's now about 40 years old, is blind, and like Ruth all the time, she'd just be like, I can't wait till the resurrection of all things. Like Joy's gonna see. She's like, I wonder what it's gonna be like for Joy to see. And you could just tell she would just, like, she really believed it. It wasn't just some sort of like, this is a nice thing to make hard things go away. It was like, it was really what she was holding on to. So yeah, I was just even reminded of that being with them on Monday. Okay, 2, Jesus ascends. The creed says Jesus ascended into heaven. Like I said, my friend out in Colorado, JT English, he says this is the forgotten work of the gospel. Even if you think about it, a lot of times if we think about like, did you share the gospel with somebody? Like usually what we mean, especially in like, I'm an unashamed Baptist, okay? But I will say a lot of times for us as Baptists, when we say share the gospel, we're like, do you know that you're a sinner and Jesus died for you? Right? And it's just interesting that like Paul like adds a lot more to that in terms of the gospel. Like Jesus did live, he did die, but he also resurrected, and he ascended, and he's seated at the right hand of the Father. And so this is an essential component of understanding what Jesus did. So we would reject that the ascension is not non-essential. That is a terrible grammatical sentence, but you get what I'm saying here. I'll say it in the affirmative. It's very important, okay? That's what I would say. It's very important. I was like, looking at this, I was like, who wrote that? Me, okay. Okay, so let's see 3 implications of the ascension. 1, it's an affirmation of the material. In Acts 1:9, that's when they actually see Jesus' ascension. We think it's 40 days after the actual resurrection of Jesus. When they said these things, they were looking on, and he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. Like they watched the physical body of Jesus go away. So he was not, I like what did Pastor Thomas say last week, that like heaven is not us as sort of disembodied cherub baby-esque spirits wearing diapers, like living and consuming Cool Whip, right? And a lot of times that's the way that heaven is portrayed, and we're like, well, that's not a very compelling image of, like, why would I even want to go to heaven? But what we see in Jesus, actually Paul calls Jesus' resurrection the first fruits. It is a glimpse of the restoration of all things, and even the image of Jesus physically going to the right hand of the Father. Isn't it interesting, right? Like, I'm not particularly comforted by a disembodied spirit giving me warm fuzzies. That makes me feel more weird than it does excited. But the fact that like, when we come to God, we will be embraced and we will see the physical Jesus. Have you ever thought about that? And in case you wonder about this, you can actually go further in Acts. Acts chapter 6, I know we have some deacons in the room, and who's the first deacon that we at least know well is a guy named Stephen, right? And Stephen preaches, I think, actually the longest recorded sermon in the totality of the Bible. And then Stephen gets stoned for doing so. And at the end of that, in Acts chapter 7, he looks up and he sees the physical Jesus gazing upon him. Interestingly enough, standing, not seated. We'll talk about that. But it's like, can you imagine the comfort? Like, look, here's one of the things. If you go through something really hard, which any of us in this room have done life long enough that we've gone through something hard, a lot of times what we want more than anything else is just somebody to be with us. Like, what we fear more than even the implications of the hard is being alone in the midst of the hard. And a disembodied sort of ethereal spirit cannot be with you in the midst of going through tragedies. But like Stephen at the end of Acts 7, looking up in the midst of him being murdered for the proclamation of the gospel, and Jesus receiving him and smiling upon him and embracing him to bring him home is exactly what our hearts long for when we go through hard things. 2, we see that the ascension is the exaltation of Jesus following his humiliation. It's interesting, if you look at Philippians 2, verses 1 through 11, we see that Jesus is found in human form. I'm looking particularly in verse 8. He's humbled. So even though he was the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. He emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man, and he emptied himself. He humiliates himself to become like us. You know, it's interesting, right? Because for most of us, we use rights and power and privileges to get as far away from brokenness as possible, right? Like, that's just instinctual in any of us. Like, we're trying to get as far away from pain as possible if we have the power and the abilities and the resources to do this. And Jesus did this very counterintuitive thing where he kind of moved into like the worst neighborhood in the cosmos called Earth, totally corrupted by sin. And he stepped out of heaven into history to become a man and to experience the fullness of what it looks like to do life in a broken and tragic place called Earth that is totally corrupted by sin. But Jesus, he only temporarily humiliates himself, but he actually ascends and he is crowned with glory and honor. God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. You get these glimpses of it even in the New Testament, right? Like the Transfiguration is a great example of this, where it's like you just get a glimpse of them. They're like, oh, we were just seeing through a veil of who you really were. You were sort of temporarily emptying yourself of the fullness of your glory and honor. And as you are ascending, we are seeing who you really are and the full rights and privileges that were deserving to you alone. 3rd, we see with the ascension, the cosmic reign and rule of Jesus. And so I'm going to kind of two-part this one. I'm going to talk about the cosmic implication of this with the ascension, and then we'll talk about the reign and rule part as we talk about Jesus being seated. But the idea of Jesus ascending is that he is able to reign and rule everywhere, not just in Jerusalem. So like his reign and rule, because he's ascended, is not just located to a specific geographical area, but instead he is ascended. He is able to reign and rule. There is no square inch of the cosmos that Jesus is not able to claim is fully and entirely his. Paul says in Ephesians 1 that he has been exalted far above all rule and authority and power and dominion and above every name that is named. So not just first century Roman Jewish authorities, although he did conquer and was over that, but he is able, not only in this age, but also in the age to come. Every place, everywhere, Jesus is king because he has ascended. All right, so here's the question I'm going to ask you, and then we will come back together. I frame this, and then you know what happens. You write this, and then you print it, and then you're like, I don't like that question. So the way I wrote this is, has Jesus' ascension been included in your understanding of the gospel? You can go with that. Here's how I wrote it that I like it more. What do you think we're missing out on when we don't mention the ascension, when we think of, like, when we include that in the gospel? Does that make sense? When we don't mention the ascension, when the gospel is just, do you know that you're a sinner and Jesus died for you? And we leave out the ascension, what do you think we're practically missing out on? Why does that matter so much? Make sense? Okay. A couple minutes with that question, and then we will talk about Jesus being seated. My words of wisdom? Oh boy. No, I don't want to answer the question. Anybody have something that feel like was worth sharing? Every time somebody shared it, it's been the best part of the night. So, what'd you say? You're not sure? Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways, if you had the trouble with that question, the ascension, it should cultivate within us a sense of expectancy. Like, Jesus is going somewhere to go do something right now before he goes to, returns at the end of the age to judge the living and the dead. So it builds within us, like, maybe even with that, you're like, I still don't really understand why the ascension is a big deal. It leads to, it facilitates the ability for him to be seated at the right hand of the Father. The Creed says, and don't miss this, okay? This is the only present tense description of Jesus in the totality of the Creed. Next week, it immediately gets to the future, that Jesus will judge in the future the living and the dead. So at this point, everything has been past tense. Next week, future tense. We have this one little line here, present tense, is. What a big word. Is, right there. Jesus is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. So what we deny is Jesus is not currently doing nothing. There's another double negative, I know. But is seated at the right hand of the Father, conducting his heavenly court and fulfilling his threefold messianic office. So what we see throughout the Old Testament is there's a sense of expectancy that the Messiah, and as the Old Testament goes on, there's greater and greater clarity of the work that the Messiah is going to do, what the Savior of the world is going to do. That man promised in Genesis 3:15, who is going to crush the head of the serpent, who is going to come through the seed of a woman, is going to do. And he is going to be a prophet, he is going to be a priest, and he is going to be a king. And people have said, how could that possibly be possible all in one person? And Jesus, Old Testament is the anticipation of this, and then the New Testament is Jesus as the answer and the culmination of this. So we see, for example, Jesus is conducting his heavenly court, he is acting as king, and he's exercising his messianic offices. We see that he is a prophet. How is he a prophet? He is a prophet through speaking the truth and the sending of his Spirit. For example, he says in John chapter 14 that the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you. He is the prophet who speaks, and we hear, and we listen, and we obey. The prophet, who was the prophet in the Old Testament? The prophet was the one who spoke on behalf of God. And here's Jesus saying, I'm the truest and best prophet who speaks without error on behalf of God through my Spirit. Second, he is our priest. He consoles us. He makes intercession for us. He allows us to enter in without fear and trembling into the throne room of grace. There's two different verses I want to call to your attention. The first is Hebrews 10, verses 11 through 14. This is very interesting because whoever wrote Hebrews, there's debate, was it Luke, was it Paul, was it somebody else? Whoever wrote Hebrews in the first century, it's interesting. He answers this question like, why is Jesus seated? Like, what's the big deal about him being seated? Now, what does seated communicate? Seated communicates. So, for example, all of you have probably had a long day. Has anybody here not had a long day? Is anybody like, man, I'm just getting my day started? All right? Okay, so all of y'all have had a long day. You know, you've worked, you've fought Nashville traffic, you're exhausted. Some of you have to, like me, mostly my wife, get 4 kids down for bed when you get home. And finally, whatever time it is, 9, 10 o'clock, what are you going to do? You are going to sit down because your work is done for the day, right? Isn't that what happened? Like, you know that feeling of like, okay, now you have to get back up again. And what's interesting is that the author of Hebrews makes this point about the intercessory sacrificial work of Jesus, is that he is the high priest who is able to sit down. All the other priests, they would stand up. But Jesus can sit down because when he declared that it is finished, all the sacrifice that was necessary for the forgiveness of sins and the reconciliation between sinful people and a holy God was satisfied at the cross of Christ. The author of Hebrews, he says, every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ has offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet, which is fulfillment of Psalm 110. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. I feel like the Spirit prompted me to say this. Let me give you a really, I know your sacrifices in Old Testament and, Jesus seated, standing. Why does this matter? Here's my observation. For example, when Christians make mistakes, a lot of times what they believe is they have to beat themselves up in order to be able to enter back into the presence of God. Especially if you've been dealing with chronic, I've been trying to beat this sin, trying to beat this sin, trying to beat this sin. And then when the sin beats you, you beat yourself up and you're kind of like, okay, well, once I do my penance and do this and beat myself up and hate on myself enough, and I probably shouldn't even go to church for an extended period of time and I don't even deserve to be there over and over and over and over again. Those are just 21st century expressions of sacrifice. If I just punish myself to such a degree, I can be made right again to enter back into the throne room of grace. Beloved, what the author of Hebrews is saying is the payment for sin has been paid once and for all. You do not have to punish yourself for your sins because Jesus has already been punished in your place and he has sat down saying the work is finished. And we consequently then can, when we sin, we can, like the prodigal son does in Luke 15, always run back home. Luke 15 is repentance illustrated, that it's always safe to return home and we will be met by the embrace of a Father who's ready to throw a party on our behalf. Why? Because God doesn't take sin seriously? No, he takes it so unbelievably serious. But the consequences of sin were poured out on him once and for all, and Christ was seated, saying that it was finished. Also, to go back to the verse that we said at the very beginning, Jesus is interceding for us right now. Now, if this idea is compelling to you, I want to recommend to you a book that was written in the 1600s by a guy named Thomas Goodwin. He was a Puritan. Full disclosure, I think most Puritan stuff is very hard to read, and a bunch of Christians try to say how great it is, and they don't understand what it means, but it just seems cool to say, read the Puritans. But this is one of the Puritan books. I'd be like, this is a great book. It's called The Heart of Christ, and it sounds like this guy was an emotional health guy from the 21st century. He was 5 centuries before his time. I love this book. I have cried my way through different portions of this book. And if you notice, half of my, a quarter of my notes is giving you a very long quote from this book, which is a public speaking faux pas, but it's that good. And so I just want to read this over you. The point that Goodwin is making is that when we think about Jesus making intercession, what it means is, it's we can read the New Testament and we can see the experiences that people had with Jesus and been like, oh, this would have been so cool. Oh, could you imagine what it would be like to experience such kindness and such compassion in the midst of, going through this? And the point that Goodwin is making is the good news of the resurrection, ascension, and intercessory work of Jesus is the same Jesus who's extending to weary, tired, broken, scared, discouraged people love and compassion and power in the first century Middle East is extending to us those very same realities today. Listen to what Goodwin says. He says, there is assurance of poor souls that the pity and compassion of Jesus' heart remains the same as it was on earth. There in heaven, he intercedes for us with the same heart as he did here below. He is as meek, as gentle, as willing to help, as tender in his affections as he was then, so they can approach him as easily about the great question of their salvation as they might have if they had been on earth with him. Therefore, how his heart appears to be towards us at his resurrection will be reliable evidence of how his heart continues to be in heaven. To demonstrate this point further, consider that if ever there was a test of whether or not his love for sinners would continue, it would be that at his resurrection, because all of his disciples, especially Peter, had behaved as unworthily as possible towards him since he was last with them. And they acted like this when he was in the process of performing his greatest act of love for them, namely dying for them, that has ever been shown by anyone. By the way, this is often, you can just see him writing a stream of consciousness. By the way, this is often how God arranges things. He often brings us the greatest of mercies and accomplishes our greatest good at the time when we are sinning against him most deeply. He does this to more clearly display the greatness of his love. It's interesting to me. I preached through the Gospel of Mark over 2 years. I think it was 2015 to 2016. There was one line in it that was my favorite verse of all the others. And I'm trying to remember, I think it's Mark 16:2. I know I make that big statement, then I'm like, I don't know what the verse is, but I think it's Mark 16:2. And it's the moment after the resurrection. Well, let me look this up here so I can give it to you reliably. Oh, sorry, Mark 16:7. Jesus died, he's resurrected, all his followers have scattered, and he says this, but go, this is illustrating Goodwin's point here, but go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. Now, you know why it's my favorite verse? Is it's so weird that Jesus would tell these women to tell the disciples, hey, tell the disciples and Peter the plan's on. Now, why would Jesus specifically name Peter? There's two explanations. One would be the Catholic explanation that I don't think is correct. And the other is that Peter had so messed up that when he heard, hey, the disciples are supposed to meet Jesus, the plan is still on, he would say, oh, I'm too bad. And can you imagine the good news that sprung into Peter's heart when one of the women's like, oh, Peter, by the way, Jesus asked specifically for you. I mean, can you imagine like you thought you were out and you got to be back in? And the point that Goodwin is making is you're like, God, that would be amazing if that happened to me. And he's saying it is ours in the resurrection, ascension, and intercessory work of Jesus. We can like admire it and be like, that would be cool, but that's what is afforded to us in the gospel. And then third and finally, prophet, priest, and king. His reign and rule is happening in this age and the age to come. Paul says this in Ephesians 1, that he has far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the age to come. And so consequently, the point that we're seeing is that Jesus is a king who is reigning, who is pushing back darkness. Even, it's really interesting to think about, that is really the fundamental work of the church. It's not to provide great programming or to be competitive with the other churches around. We are agents of light advancing the kingdom on behalf of a king, and we are taking enemy-occupied territory, little by little, like area by area, block by block. I think it's even one of the reasons that this corner is probably so opposed and there's a lot of spiritual warfare, is like, this is enemy-occupied territory, and to think of our mission through that lens, even to think like, that's, the enemy is Satan and not one another, and we're fighting on behalf, united underneath King Jesus, provides a lot of reconciliation where there could be potential division as well. So Jesus is a prophet, he's a priest, he is a king, he is exhibiting that reign and rule over our lives right here, right now, until we wait for him, as we'll see next week, to return back to judge the living and the dead. All right, one more question, and then if you have any questions you want me to try to do my best to answer, we will, and then we'll read the creed together. So here's the third and final question for your tables. What practically changes in your life with the awareness and comfort that Jesus is currently acting as prophet, priest, and king right now?